So September 20th was when everything went completely sideways. I brought Marcus to dinner at my parents' estate to finally introduce him properly. The house is this big colonial-style place with a formal dining room that my mom loves to use for special occasions. She made this elaborate meal with all my favorite dishes, and I was actually feeling pretty good about the whole thing. Marcus was being his usual charming self, asking my dad about the business and complimenting my mom on the food. My dad seemed to like him well enough at first. They talked about sports and current events, nothing too heavy. I was starting to relax and think this was going exactly how I hoped it would. Then about halfway through dinner, my dad got this weird look on his face and said he had something important to discuss. He told me he'd been thinking about my future a lot lately and wanted to talk about some opportunities. I figured he was going to offer me a job at the company or something like that. Instead, he started talking about how important it was for family businesses to form strategic partnerships. He said he'd been working on a major deal that would secure our family's future for generations. I was confused because this seemed like a weird time to talk business with my boyfriend right there. That's when he dropped the bomb. He told me he'd arranged for me to marry his business partner, Robert Chun. Just said it straight out like he was announcing what we were having for dessert. He explained that Robert was 45, very successful, and that combining our families would create this powerful business alliance. Marcus literally stopped eating and just stared. I thought my dad was joking at first, so I laughed and asked what he was really talking about. But he kept going, explaining how he'd already discussed everything with Robert, and they'd worked out all the details. He said Robert was excited to meet me properly, and they'd planned a formal introduction for the following week. I told him he had to be kidding and that I was obviously with Marcus. My dad barely looked at Marcus and said that was just a casual relationship that needed to end now that we had serious plans to make. He acted like Marcus wasn't even a real person, just some temporary thing I was playing around with. Marcus finally found his voice and asked if this was really happening. My dad told him very politely that he should probably leave and let our family discuss private matters. The whole thing was so surreal I didn't know how to react. I stood up and told my dad this was insane, and that I wasn't marrying anyone I didn't choose myself. He got this cold look I'd never seen before, and said I needed to think carefully about my responsibilities to the family. He reminded me that everything I had came from his hard work, and that I owed him this consideration. My mom just sat there looking uncomfortable, but didn't say anything to support me. I think she was as shocked as I was, but she's never been one to contradict my dad directly. Marcus asked if he should stay, but I told him I'd call him later because I needed to handle this family meeting first. After Marcus left, my dad continued like nothing weird had happened. He pulled out this folder with information about Robert's business and started showing me financial projections about how successful our combined companies would be. He talked about Robert like he was discussing a stock investment, mentioning his assets and business connections. I kept telling him I wasn't interested and that this whole idea was crazy. He said I was being emotional and not thinking logically about the opportunity. He actually used the word opportunity like he was offering me a promotion instead of trying to control my entire life. The dinner ended with him telling me to take a few days to think it over rationally. He said he was confident I'd see the wisdom in the arrangement once I considered all the benefits. I left feeling like I'd entered some alternate reality where my dad had completely lost his mind. The next day I went straight to my dad's office downtown. I needed to understand if he was serious about this marriage thing, or if he'd somehow come to his senses overnight. His assistant told me he was expecting me, which was weird since I hadn't called ahead. His office is on the top floor of this building he owns, all dark wood and expensive furniture. He was sitting behind his massive desk looking completely calm, like we hadn't had the most insane conversation of my life the night before. He asked me to sit down and said he hoped I'd thought about everything he'd explained. I told him I'd thought about it plenty and the answer was absolutely not. I explained that I loved Marcus and wasn't interested in meeting Robert, or anyone else he wanted to set me up with. I tried to be respectful but firm about the whole thing. He listened without interrupting, then opened his desk drawer and pulled out some legal documents. He said he'd hoped I would be more reasonable, but he'd prepared for this possibility. He slid the papers across the desk and told me to read them carefully. It was his will. I'm a lawyer, so I know how to read legal documents, and this thing was crystal clear. He'd completely removed me as a beneficiary, not reduced my inheritance or put conditions on it, totally eliminated me. The will stated that if I refused to marry Robert Chen by December 31st, I would receive nothing from his estate. $0, no property, no business shares, nothing. I asked him if he was seriously threatening to disinherit me over this. He said it wasn't a threat, it was a business decision. He explained that he'd built everything for the family, and if I wasn't willing to do what was best for the family, then I wasn't really part of it anymore. He pulled out another document that showed the current value of his estate. We're talking about millions of dollars, plus the business which generates serious income every year. He reminded me that I'd grown up with every advantage because of his success, and that this was my chance to secure that lifestyle permanently. I told him money wasn't everything and that I had my own career. He laughed and said my lawyer's salary was nothing compared to what I'd have access to as Robert's wife. He showed me Robert's financial statements and pointed out that the guy was worth even more than our family. Then he got really cold and explained the business situation. He said the company was facing some serious competition from overseas and needed Robert's connections to survive. He told me that without this partnership, he might lose everything anyway, so my inheritance could disappear regardless of what I chose. I asked why the partnership required marriage and couldn't just be a normal business deal. He said Robert had specifically requested a family alliance, and that marriages create stronger bonds than contracts. He claimed Robert was a traditional man who valued family connections over purely financial arrangements. He gave me this speech about sacrifice and duty, saying that previous generations of women understood their responsibilities to their families. He said I'd been too influenced by modern ideas about independence, and needed to remember where my loyalty belonged. I stood up to leave and told him I needed time to process everything. He said I had until the end of the month to give him my final answer. He reminded me that Robert was being very patient, but wouldn't wait indefinitely for a response. As I was walking out, he called after me and said he hoped I'd make the smart choice. He told me to think about what kind of future I wanted, and whether my pride was worth giving up everything I'd ever known. The whole conversation left me feeling sick and confused about who my father really was. A week later, I went to see Patricia Williams at Morrison & Associates, this law firm that specializes in family law and estate planning. I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with legally, and whether my dad could actually do what he was threatening. Patricia is this sharp woman in her 50s who's handled some pretty complex family disputes. I explained the whole situation and showed her copies of the will and the other documents my dad had given me. She read everything carefully and asked a bunch of questions about the timeline and my dad's mental state. She confirmed that the will was completely legal and enforceable. She said parents have the right to distribute their assets however they want, and conditioning inheritance on marriage isn't technically illegal, even though it's ethically questionable. She explained that challenging the will would be extremely difficult and expensive. Then she asked to see any other documents related to the marriage arrangement. I told her I didn't have anything else, just what my dad had shown me about Robert's finances. She said that was interesting because usually these kinds of arrangements involve more formal agreements. She made some calls while I waited and managed to get some information about Robert Chen's business dealings. Turns out he's been involved in several partnerships that included marriage arrangements with business partners' daughters. Patricia said this was a pattern that suggested something more formal than just traditional matchmaking. She recommended hiring a private investigator to look deeper into Robert's background and business practices. She said if we could prove the marriage was part of a larger pattern of coercion or fraud, we might have grounds to challenge the whole arrangement. Patricia also explained that even if the will was valid, there might be ways to prove my dad was using undue influence or duress to force the marriage. She said the key would be documenting everything and building a case that showed I was being coerced rather than making a free choice. She asked me to think carefully about whether I was prepared for a long legal battle. She warned me that my dad obviously had significant resources and would probably hire expensive lawyers to fight back. She said family law cases like this can drag on for years and get very ugly. The most disturbing thing she told me was about a case she'd handled a few years ago. Another family had tried to arrange a marriage for business reasons, and when the daughter refused, they'd actually tried to have her declared mentally incompetent. Patricia said wealthy families sometimes use extreme tactics when this much money is involved. She pulled out another file and showed me a contract from that previous case. It was a formal marriage agreement that treated the bride like a business asset, specifying exactly what she would and wouldn't be allowed to do after the marriage. The document included clauses about her behavior, her role in business decisions, and even restrictions on her personal relationships. Patricia asked if I'd seen anything like that in my situation. I told her my dad hadn't shown me any marriage contract, just the financial information about Robert. She said that was suspicious and suggested there were probably additional documents I hadn't seen yet. She recommended that I try to get access to any other paperwork related to the arrangement. She said if there was a formal contract treating me like property, that could be grounds for legal action beyond just challenging the will. Before I left, Patricia gave me the contact information for a private investigator named David Torres who specialized in financial fraud cases. She said if Robert had done this before, David would be able to find the evidence we needed to prove it. A month later, I met with David Torres at his office in this converted warehouse downtown. He's this former FBI agent who now does private investigation work, mostly financial crimes and background checks for law firms. Patricia had recommended him specifically for digging into Robert's business history. David had already started preliminary research based on what Patricia had told him. He spread out a bunch of documents on his conference table and started walking me through what he'd found. The information was way worse than I'd expected. Robert Chun had been married 3 times before, and every single marriage was connected to a business deal. His first wife was the daughter of a shipping company owner in California. They got married, Robert's business absorbed her father's company, and then they divorced 2 years later. She got almost nothing in the settlement because of a prenup that gave Robert control of everything. The second marriage was to a woman whose family owned manufacturing facilities in Texas. Same pattern marriage, business merger, divorce within 3 years. The third wife's family had import connections in Asia that Robert needed for his expansion. That marriage lasted 4 years but ended the same way as the others. David showed me court documents from the divorce proceedings. In each case, the women had tried to claim they'd been deceived about the nature of the marriage, but the prenups were ironclad. They'd all signed agreements that essentially made them business partners rather than equal spouses. The most disturbing part was what happened to the women after the divorces. David had tracked down 2 of the ex-wives and they'd both described similar experiences. They said Robert had been controlling and manipulative during the marriages, treating them more like employees than partners. Both women said they'd felt trapped and isolated. David pulled out another set of documents that made my stomach drop. He'd found a copy of the actual marriage contract between Robert and my father. It wasn't just a business partnership agreement. It was a detailed contract that specified exactly what my role would be as Robert's wife. The contract stated that I would be expected to relocate to Robert's home in another state. It included clauses about my involvement in business decisions, restrictions on my career, and requirements for social appearances. There was even a section about children and how they would be raised to eventually take over the combined business interests. The most shocking part was a clause that gave Robert and my father joint control over major decisions in my life, including where I could work and who I could associate with. It basically treated me like a business asset that they would manage together. David explained that this kind of contract was legally questionable at best. He said it looked more like an ownership agreement than a marriage contract, and that could be grounds for challenging the whole arrangement in court. He'd also found financial records showing that my father's business was in worse shape than he'd let on. The company was carrying significant debt and had been losing major contracts over the past 2 years. David said it looked like my dad was desperate for Robert's financial backing and was willing to do anything to secure it. The investigation had uncovered communications between my father and Robert discussing the arrangement. David showed me emails where they talked about me like I was a commodity they were negotiating over. Robert had actually specified certain requirements he had for his future wife, including age, education level, and family background. David recommended that we document everything and prepare for the possibility that my father might escalate his pressure tactics. He said men like Robert and my dad don't usually back down easily when they've invested this much planning in an arrangement. He also suggested that I consider getting a restraining order if my father continued to pressure me about the marriage. David said the evidence of coercion was strong enough that a court might intervene to protect me from further harassment. 6 weeks later, I was at the courthouse filing for a restraining order against both my father and Robert Chun. David Torres had helped me compile all the evidence we'd gathered, and Patricia Williams was representing me in the legal proceedings. I tried one more time to reason with my father before taking legal action. I'd called him and explained that I knew about Robert's previous marriages and the real contract they'd drawn up. I thought maybe if he understood that I knew the truth, he'd back down from the whole thing. Instead, he'd gotten angry and accused me of hiring people to spy on the family. He said I was being ungrateful and disrespectful, and that he was disappointed in how I'd turned out. He told me I had 1 week to agree to meet with Robert or he'd consider our relationship permanently severed. That's when I decided I needed legal protection. Patricia had warned me that desperate people sometimes do desperate things, and my father was clearly not thinking rationally about the situation. The day of the hearing, my father showed up with 2 expensive lawyers from some big downtown firm. They were clearly trying to intimidate me with their presence, but Patricia had prepared me for that possibility. She told me to focus on the facts and let the evidence speak for itself. The judge was this older woman named Judge Martinez who'd apparently seen similar cases before. She listened carefully as Patricia presented our evidence about the coercive nature of the marriage arrangement and Robert's history of using marriages for business purposes. My father's lawyers tried to argue that this was just a family disagreement, and that parents have the right to encourage their children to make good decisions. They claimed the inheritance issue was separate from the marriage discussion, and that my father was just trying to ensure the family business survived. But then Patricia presented the marriage contract that David had uncovered. She showed the judge the specific clauses that treated me like property, and the communications between my father and Robert discussing me like a business asset. The judge's expression changed completely when she saw those documents. Patricia also presented testimony from Robert's ex-wives that David had obtained. They'd agreed to provide sworn statements about their experiences and the pattern of deception they'd encountered. Their stories were remarkably similar and painted a clear picture of Robert's methods. The judge asked my father's lawyers to explain the marriage contract and why it included clauses that seemed to violate basic principles of personal autonomy. They couldn't provide a satisfactory answer and started arguing that the contract was just a preliminary document that would have been modified before any actual marriage. Judge Martinez wasn't buying their explanations. She said the evidence clearly showed a pattern of coercion and manipulation, designed to pressure me into an unwanted marriage. She granted the restraining order and specifically prohibited both my father and Robert from contacting me about marriage arrangements. She also ordered that any future contact had to go through attorneys and couldn't include threats about inheritance or other financial consequences. The judge said she was concerned about the controlling nature of the proposed arrangement and wanted to ensure I had protection from further pressure. After the hearing, my father tried to approach me in the hallway, but his own lawyer stopped him and reminded him about the restraining order. He looked genuinely shocked that things had gone this far, like he'd never considered that I might actually fight back legally. Patricia told me later that she thought the judge had been particularly disturbed by the marriage contract and Robert's history. She said cases like this were becoming more common as some wealthy families tried to use traditional arranged marriage concepts to facilitate business deals. Epilogue *. So that was 8 months ago and things have definitely settled down since then. The restraining order is still in place and I haven't heard from my father or Robert Chen since the court hearing. My dad's lawyers reached out once to see if I wanted to discuss reconciliation, but I told Patricia I wasn't interested in any contact right now. Marcus and I are still together and actually stronger than before. Going through all that drama really showed me what kind of person he is and how much he supports me. He never pressured me to choose him over my family's money, which meant a lot during the whole mess. I'm still working at the same law firm and doing well professionally. Losing the inheritance was scary at first, but I've realized I'm better off building my own success rather than depending on my father's money. It's actually been liberating to know that everything I have is something I earned myself. Patricia helped me set up a legal trust to protect my assets in case my father tries anything else in the future. She said wealthy parents sometimes try to manipulate their adult children in other ways, so it's good to have protections in place. I heard through mutual friends that my father's business ended up partnering with Robert anyway, just without the marriage component. Apparently they found other ways to structure their deal, which proves the whole marriage thing was never actually necessary for their business relationship. The whole experience taught me a lot about family dynamics and how money can corrupt relationships. I'm sad about losing my relationship with my parents, but I'm not willing to sacrifice my autonomy for financial security. Some things are worth more than money, And my freedom to choose my own life is definitely one of them.